Hello and welcome. I'm Andy Hodges and I'm here at the 30th session of the Intergovernmental Committee of Senior Officials and Experts of Southern Africa in Livingstone, Zambia. It's been held under the auspices of the Economic Commission for Africa, Sub-Regional Office for Southern Africa, of course that's UNECA, of course being hosted by the government of Zambia. We have been talking to government officials, private sector, and all sorts of other players in the energy sector, particularly in the renewable energy sector, because of course the theme of the conference is delivering renewable energy resources for a just energy transition in Southern Africa. But of course, all stakeholders are represented at the conference here in Livingstone, and one of those is OXFAM International. And I'm now joined by Ms. Dailes Judge, Africa Deputy Director of OXFAM International. Ms. Judge, thank you for talking to us. Most appreciate that.
Thank you for the opportunity.
I think just for the sake of our viewers, I do know OXFAM quite well. I've done a bit of work with them, but what is OXFAM? What is your mandate? Where are you actually working in Southern Africa, etc.?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. So OXFAM is a well-known international NGO that has a multi-mandate, if I can put it that way. Our work is in a number of countries across the world. It is made up of a number of affiliates, about 20 of them, and the different affiliates then support different programs in different countries. I am part of the OXFAM International team working in Africa, and within Africa we are working in 18 countries. In the 18 countries we do have an Africa strategy that focuses on a number of areas or pathways of change, if I can put it that way. And these include accountable governance, economic justice, climate justice, gender justice, and humanitarian action. And you will see from our work that there's a lot of justice.
It's a good word, isn't it?
Yeah. Ensuring that there is actually fairness and equity in the things that we do in the different countries. And our mission really is to impact on poverty and inequality. And that's what we do. Within the Southern Africa region, we do have the OXFAM in Southern Africa cluster, and it's a cluster of countries that is Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Mozambique, and they cover the whole SADC region, and they do actually have similar areas of programming as I mentioned. So that's essentially what we're doing.
Now, it's interesting because, of course, we're now going through a terrible El Nino-induced drought. Over 60 million people may require food assistance. We're looking at countries that thought they were achieving some form of food security. Suddenly, 180 U-turn and food security isn't there anymore. And in fact, we're starting to see, unfortunately, some of the gains achieved to lifting some of the citizens out of poverty being reversed as well. So talk to me about your views on the energy deficit, power, and how that is impacting poverty, inequality, and socio-economic development.
There are a number of points that one would raise in terms of the energy deficit. The one thing to say is that Africa is very rich in natural resources. We do have quite a very strong cultural diversity to back it up, and with a very youthful population and the kind of resources that we have, one would think that we would have a very, high-performing Africa, as it were. But that said, the potential in Africa is unparalleled, and I think we have potential to contribute to the world. Unfortunately, even with a positive kind of outlook, we still have many of the Africans that, are still energy starved, if I can put it that way. And I was just looking at my numbers here. An estimated 600 million, or at least 53% of Africa's population is lacking electricity. And for the most part, those in rural areas don't even have clean cooking technologies, and so they depend on limited cooking technologies. Yes, like firewood and charcoal, which is it. Yeah, absolutely, and it also has its own effects. And within Southern Africa, I was also just checking that 32% of our rural population in Southern Africa does not have access to energy, and that's quite a significant proportion to deal with. So the impacts would be many. There would be impacts at community level, at national level, and also at continental level. If I just start to speak with the impacts, or to speak on the impacts at community level, you will find that a lot of our women are impacted negatively, so to speak. So women often bear the brunt of the energy shortage, and we see that presented in more responsibilities at household level. So they have to fetch, the firewood, and because there's no electricity or proper energy, it means that other aspects of water, for example, sanitation, are also affected. And it takes a lot of time for the women to be in these spaces to, mobilize around those household needs, and therefore taking their time away from paid care work and participation in economic activities. But like we said, they use charcoal and all that. It brings in issues of indoor pollution, and obviously that then impacts on health issues. And if you are in a space where you are lacking energy to sufficiently care for your needs, even your ability to be able to meet the healthcare costs also becomes challenging. I live in an area in Lusaka where there are women who make flitters and they sell on the roadside. And now with the impact of not having electricity, in my area we have power from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. every day. So who would actually start make a business at that particular time? So you can see the erosion that these people, their resilience, and because it's a hand-to-mouth kind of business, their resilience is, and coping mechanism is totally eroded. But we also have other impacts at national level, for example, where critical minerals would actually be available in a country, but we cannot maximize them to the fullest because industry is not functioning at its full potential. Yesterday I spoke about the example of Zimbabwe that has lithium deposits, and they really have put up an agenda to exploit these lithium deposits to, put up a refinery, as it were. Beneficiation and value addition, employment creation comes in. But with the energy crisis, they can't do that. So it means that the whole value chain that they thought, would be supportive of the country actually gets to be impacted.
I want to look at inequality because as we were talking off camera, I was talking about how the concern of looking at an energy transition, but looking at urban areas and really not focusing at the national level on rural areas. So in a way, you are increasing the inequality for women, for youth, for the marginalized communities, in fact, for all citizens in rural areas, while you're boosting economic growth and industrialization in cities. In a way, you're almost forcing citizens to move to the cities if they want to be economically viable. Is that a true statement or not? What are your views on that?
Well, that's totally true because the communities in the rural areas are energy poor. Even before we talk about this crisis, they are, to start with, poor because they don't have the basics. We know that 60% of most rural populations are poor. And that is a situation they live in during the times of, plenty in terms of energy. When we add this energy starvation, essentially what we are saying is that we are adding the poverty on top of poverty. And that stretches, the situation of the rural populations into an extreme dire situation. I think that we haven't thought enough about solutions, that would be benefiting the rural areas, like mini grids, for example. Those are solutions that, if well, planned and invested in, could open up opportunities for the.
I think that one of the concerns about that, of course, is that most private sector participants want to get into a viable, profitable project, and them putting that sort of project up in communities, rural areas. I mean, that's more a governmental job rather than private sector, because they don't see any money in it. I think, and that's one of the issues with the private sector, isn't it? So in a way, government have to step up to try and rural electrification, if I can call it that, and the private sector then will get involved in larger projects. Is that what you're seeing in South SADC and Southern Africa?
Certainly true. There's a whole aspect of de-risking investments for the private sector, and I think it's about how we engage in that conversation of enabling the private sector by having an environment that is supportive of their investments. I think one of the conversations that we've had in the conference is around PPPs. That's an area that would definitely, help not only in cushioning the high cost of the investment, but also giving possibility of having to spread the risk that comes with the concerns that private sector has. I think that the government has a responsibility, one, to make the environment for the private sector well enough, conducive is the word, conducive for them to be able to go into the community. So the PPPs would be a good way.
Talk to me, because we always hear this word socio-economic development, and I think a lot of people don't really understand what that means, particularly if we're looking at it from a rural area perspective. So maybe you could tell us exactly what socio-economic development is it in this context, in the context of the energy deficiency and the energy starvation, if I can call it that, particularly, which I think is important in the rural areas where the majority of our citizens live.
Well, it's really about integrating the social aspects and the economic aspects, and we know that private sector would focus on the economic aspect because the motive is profit, and who else then would pick up the social, even the environmental aspect of it. And I think this is where an integrated approach to solving the energy crisis would be important. In talking about socio-economic development, I think the social aspect would be amplified by a lot of consultation with the communities. I think they have to be a key part of the development agenda. We believe that any massive intervention like an energy project would necessitate at least some informed and prior conversation with the communities, so that they highlight what the needs are, how the needs could be. Community engagement and consultation.
Giving them
and building off their recommendations as well as solutions that they offer. Because if anything, if you think about it, whenever there's a crisis, the community is the first line of defense for itself. They have a way of resolving the crisis, and what we are coming to do is to amplify their resilience to the crisis by enabling them.
What is OXFAM doing? I mean, here we're talking energy crisis, energy deficiency. We talk about the poverty levels going up, inequality, socioeconomic development, all of those under stress and under strain. What are you specifically doing in SADC and Southern Africa to try and alleviate, or at least assist governments, or assist them, because you obviously work with governments, obviously, when the development programs. What are you specifically doing?
But there's a lot that we are doing. One is that we are facilitating conversations on just energy transitions. And I think that it's important to bring stakeholders together, to have these conversations in a very open, candid way, and to challenge some of the things that we see in the space. One of the challenging things to put on the table is the resource requirements, for financing just energy transitions. And as much as we want to ensure that there is support and commitment to that agenda, We also want to ensure that there's accountability in the way that the resources we have are being deployed. Number two is that we seek to create agency around the issue. And we already spoke about the community engagement, and so creating agencies, ensuring that we do have the voices of the communities, of the partners that you are working with on the table in the spaces where they are. And then number three is that we also offer solutions, alternatives into what we think the situation would be. So for example, in terms of the renewable energies, we have made recommendations around improving the grid infrastructure in places so that we are, reducing the transmission losses. We have talked about the community-based initiatives. We have talked about what we think would be the conservation practices in low-income communities, for example. So we do go in with models that we think that would be replicated or scaled up. And besides that, we also look at energy crisis not only as a crisis on its own, but as a crisis in combination to other issues. So climate change comes in. We are at the COP29, and in there we are also emphasizing things that should be paid attention to: adaptation, loss and damage, being brought to the agenda, including climate finance, and part of that is to ensure that it also contributes to the agenda of resolving the energy crisis. And lastly, we also support national governments in terms of providing them with technical assistance. So for example, in this instance, we'll be talking about governments working on their national adaptation plans or NDCs and how those could be crafted. So we do provide that accompaniment.
What we're here sitting, I know the experts have all sat, and then of course the high-level officials came, but all the experts in this area sat. They've come up with various reports, recommendations, but the criticism has always been implementation. The fact that we have great paperwork, we have great policies, we even have great ideas, but it's that missing gap of implementation. So what would you hope to see as the outcome of this incredibly important conference here in Livingstone?
Yeah, you're right. And I think the important thing is to reflect on how we move from the conversations and to move from the documentation into the actual implementation. And I think maybe what is missing there is who takes the lead, who is the action owner, for each of the recommendations that we are passing, so that then there's very intentional follow through and accountability.
One country does this, another country does that, rather than who's doing it. And you all think, oh, Zimbabwe's doing it, Zambia's doing it, but actually no one.
And to that point, I think a regional approach would be a good approach to consider, because then we have a point of alignment in terms of priorities, in terms of targets, in terms of leadership, in terms of ownership of what needs to be done. Of course, bearing in mind that we do have very contextual realities that would be differently dealt with. I think that a regional approach to this would help us to unlock some of them.
And I think you've sort of said this as you've been talking, we need to also find a balance, a mix in our energy. As you said, we can't be reliant on one source. But more importantly, we need to transition over time, because we need to still industrialize, we need to grow our economies, we need to pull our people up to middle income economies, but we can't really do that by spending money on renewables when we can't even spend money on infrastructure, schools, hospitals, clinics, transport, plows for them, to agriculture. So I think it's a balancing act, and it's a very difficult balancing act. So maybe your final word.
Well, my final word is that organizations like OXFAM, the UN, the governments, pretty much the organizations that are here, we have to be intentionally looking into the policy tools that we have, because the policy tools are what unlock the process of implementation, and to see whether they are fit for purpose, and to see whether the recommendations that we are making are actually enabling some of those policy tools to be implemented. I think that we constantly need to put accountability also on the table, because unless we hold ourselves accountable, we will continue meeting and
having great
papers and not having any deliverables. So accountability mechanisms also have to accompany the policy implementation.
Ms. George Africa, Deputy Director, OXFAM International. Thank you, ma'am, for speaking to me. Most appreciated. Well, there you have it. Here in Livingstone, we have all stakeholders who are talking about this critical issue, because, again, it's critical. Whether you be in a rural area, whether you be marginalized, women, youth, whether you just be our relatives who live in the Kumusha, as I would say, in Zimbabwe, energy is a vital cog in growing our economies in Africa and Southern Africa and in SADC, but more importantly, it's a vital cog in possibly lifting our citizens out of poverty. I'm Andy Hodges. Goodbye, and please, you will be safe.